And this is the first time I'm going to attempt to live stream the Sunday supplement chat for this week. So it's the 9th of June 2024, and for those who have watched for a long time, I have been involved in a number of different live streaming things in the past, including with Helen, Piotr and Jay that we streamed for several years together, started during the pandemic. Those guys have gone off onto other commitments and probably also to protect a bit of family time on a Sunday morning. But to me, Sunday morning doesn't quite feel the same without the supplement live. So I'm going to give this a go and see how it goes. So I'm not even sure if anybody's going to tune in actually to the first one or future ones, to be honest with you. But let's see what happens. Hopefully, I'll be able to see the comments as they appear live. So I'm going to give it a go on here, see how it goes. And worst comes to worst, we still get a podcast. So for those who've tuned into the supplement before, you'll know that I like to start with a quote, and this week's is in French, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to do my best. And it is "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose," which means the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's from Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Carr, who was a French writer. So just before I get started, I see there's a few people have signed in online. Hello and good morning. Thanks for tuning in. Just a quick plug for the upcoming property business workshop. It's on Thursday, the 4th of July. Yes, we did book it before the election was called, but we've still got plenty of people turning up. And of course, you can still vote by post. We've got about 10 tickets left. We've still got the early bird discount on, which Rod keeps telling me to turn off, but we've still got the discount on for the moment. The link is bit.ly/PBWTHREE. And if you haven't been to one of our workshops before, effectively, it's a standalone day. It's not a part of a funnel or part of a package or part of anything like that. It's myself and Rod giving as much content and as much value as we can within one day. There is an option to have a dinner ticket and come out to dinner with us afterwards as well in a smaller setting and ask us anything you want. It's in central London. It's in Blackfriars. There's nothing else to think about that day, really, is there? Because I think the election result really does look like a bit of a foregone conclusion, or even a rout. Let's see. This works really well actually on this format because it's a super thing for the chat bits popping up. So thanks to those who've been commenting so far, and I'm glad you could tune in. That's brilliant notice, because in typical Adam Lawrence style, I've given no notice that I'll be doing this morning, but I somehow managed to squeeze it in. And the person who's just said my schedule is crazy, they're not wrong. I've got something to do straight after this as well, so Sundays are pretty jam-packed, but it's all good fun. So let's get on with the supplement. This week's quote is a bit of a 50-50, really. The more things change, the more they stay the same, isn't it? It might be different this time, but they're just the most dangerous phrase in forecasting when it comes to finance, apart from anything else. I mean, I think it is different because we've had a pandemic, and we haven't had a pandemic for 100 years. And there is a fairly significant change in policy responses. There's also what led up to the pandemic. And if you think about it, what led up to the last pandemic was a massive world war. World War One, and then of course there wasn't that much time between that and the next World War, and that's why, apart from anything else, a lot of economies, especially the UK, ended up with a huge amount of debt afterwards, 250% of GDP. So it really is going to be different this time, but how different? So I called it Edward Scissorhands this week, the piece, because I'm referring to the European Central Bank cutting their rates. First time in 25 years that they've front run or gone before the Federal Reserve. They've only existed for 25 years, of course, in case you didn't know that. So the first time they've ever done it. There's going to be a word you're going to keep hearing from me over the coming months until I'm proven wrong, or until I'm proven right, in which case you'll hear about it for years to come, because that's how it works. And that word is decoupling. However, before I get into that, it's going to be the usual diet for those of us who take the supplement on a weekly basis: the real-time market, the macro stats of interest, and then the deep dive. So real-time market, I always look to Chris Watkin and James Forrester's UK property market stats show. I'm grateful for Chris for the messages and things that we exchange and he replies to with me. But frankly, if he just keeps doing what he's doing, that'd be perfect, because it's by far the best bellwether of what's going on in the market. So their reports on last week that ended last Sunday, so we have to bear that in mind, but still 1 week behind. We absolutely cannot complain. That's the quickest data they can get. It includes the second May bank holiday, of course, but the tail of the tape anyway. Sold subject to contract figures per square foot are still at 5.1% on December 2023. Listings were 21% lower last week, but of course, remember the bank holiday, so there's nothing really to see there. Gross sales year to date, still 7.3% above this pre-pandemic window of 2017 to 2019 that we're really most interested in for sort of steady state, lack of volatility. That's what we want. And if you look back over sort of 20-25 years, listings have actually, well, in general, gross sales have actually been coming down and down as it's got harder to move. People have lived longer apart from anything else. Houses, of course, have got more expensive, but really frictional costs as well have gone upwards, and there's been much less activity and incentive for activity in recent years for investors, thanks to some of the tax changes apart from anything else. So it's a pretty healthy looking market, and it obviously means people can afford to buy houses, which is what we want. Listings still 8% above the pre-pandemic market average year to date, so plenty of stock on, and most listings for 8 years. That tells you there's plenty of people who held off in 2023 putting stuff on in 2024, and reductions are happening across more than 1 in 8 properties each month. The long-term average is 1 in 10, if you didn't know. But look, we've got a healthy market, we've got stabilising prices over the next few weeks, we've got a lack of momentum, but ultimately we're back from what we might remember as the doldrums of 2023. That's how I'd be framing it at the moment. So in terms of the macro, the PMIs get another shout out from me. The retail sales were also out for May. The Halifax's turn with their price index, and finally, last but never least, of course, the gilt and swap yields for those who listen regularly. So the PMIs, a confirmation of the flash figures from last week, and for the first time in a long time, all 3 of them, that's services, manufacturing and construction, were all above 50. So the services were calmer than the April's racing services print of 55, but that's probably a good thing for inflation. We don't want to be printing 55s and above for too many months in a row when we've still got an inflation problem in the system. The word that was used in the finalised services PMI report this week was solid, and that's a word that I'd love to see used again and again, quite frankly. Hiring activity also upwards, so snapping off the end of the unemployment moving upwards trend, which we don't really want. We'll see that in the official figures in July's release when May's figures are included. The next release we've got next week is for April, and that should, in my opinion, stay about the same in terms of percentages, and that is the broad economic consensus as well. Although we did have that big number that we saw in last month's report, which said we were going to lose about 100,000 jobs, which obviously would move the needle because that is a material number, but those real-time bits from the ONS are not really very reliable. So let's see. But what's the biggie? Well, the slowest increase in prices charged for over 3 years. What should we take away from that? Well, firstly, prices are still going up, but secondly, services inflation should be coming down from May's figures, which will be released in a couple of weeks. Let's not get too carried away. It's 1 month's figures, and we never get carried away on 1 month's figures. But the direction of travel finally looks good, though. Just as a bit of an aside, though, if that is reflective of May's unemployment figures that are released on Thursday, the 18th of July, that's 2 weeks before the August Bank of England meeting, which is currently favoured for a cut, it will cause a wobble. Inflation will matter as well, of course, and there are 2 prints between now and then. What we will see that's hard to see is the impact of the wage rises. Has it just been about getting heads back above water on a household level and also putting a few savings away for a rainy day, and therefore it hasn't really affected consumption largely? That could easily be the case. The real-time data for this is quite weak, or is a small sample size. Nationwide Bank do their debit card users, for example. So I'm uncertain, and I don't like that very much, if you know me at all. So, on the subject of the construction PMIs, growth was even sharper than last month, and again, employment is increasing in a market with around 400,000 fewer workers in it than there were at the peak before 2007, before the great financial crash. And input costs up only marginally, so still up but promising sounding stuff. Always good to look into the detail though. The expansion on activity on residential projects was only very marginal. Commercial work is where it's at, with civil engineering activity rising at a solid pace. That solid word we've been begging for about 4.25 years, twice in 1 day already. That's great. Now, retail sales I look at because I like to look at it as a proxy for consumption. So we're going to learn something about the overall growth of the economy. 2/3 of the economy is driven by consumption, which is massive. Not all in retail, of course, but nonetheless, it's the best open market data bellwether that we have. Markets expected 1.2% year-on-year growth, and they got 0.4. So disappointing, and this isn't adjusted for inflation, so that's another step backwards in real terms. But the same thing keeps on going on. Food sales are up because we've got more people, and affordability's also improved a bit, and non-food sales are down. That is the post-pandemic trend. Whether it's because people splurged a lot during the pandemic and bought hot tubs and Pelotons they didn't need, we could speculate. But the British Retail Consortium, who are the ones who compile these figures, point to the Euros and the Olympics as reasons that will get money out of people's pocket over the summer. And then we'll see. The commentary about the report is more positive than it's been for many months, and perhaps the sector is reaching a low point. It will take a reversal of the savings trend, though, and it's hard to explain without applying Occam's razor. Rates are up 4% plus now for people, money in the bank, and they'll take that, thank you very much. Maybe it is as simple as that. But overall, risks do look to be abating, not necessarily to the better off half of the population, because their extracurricular activities are likely, one way or another, to face larger tax rises. So, over to the Halifax report then. From a good S word, solid, to a slightly tepid one, static. That's the headline they led with. Annual rate of growth 1.5%. Monthly was minus 0.1. Consensus was plus 0.2. Nothing really to see. But deeper in the report, they talk about resilience in the market. They talk about a limited supply of available properties, which is not the reality as we've seen in terms of Chris's real-time figures, but there we go. They might mean limited affordable properties. The average asking price is 447k, and the average sale agreed asking price is 370k. So although historically that 16 to 17% sort of gap is very typical indeed, is that because Rightmove's full of punters who are selling at a ridiculous price, or is it the culture of the corporate estate agency world over-instructing and then drip, drip, drip until the price comes down to a saleable one? I don't know, perhaps a bit of both. But that 16 to 17% is typical, whereas the 2022 gap was 12.5% as the market was particularly hot. So Halifax sees the Northwest growing at 3.8% on an annual basis as Manchester continues to drive the region forward. And they also agree with Zoopla about Northern Ireland, 3.2% upwards annually. Scotland plus 1.9, Wales only plus 0.7. East of England doing particularly poorly, they single out as minus 0.8% annualised. But that's the Halifax report for you. On to the gilts and the swaps then. They're too high. That's the end. No, I'm only kidding, but not about the too high bit. The US jobs print moved the needle on Friday by 10 basis points, 0.1% upwards, because the USA created 100,000 more jobs than we expected. So we all have to pay more, 0.1% more for our mortgages, because that's what happened in the US. It doesn't really make sense to me, to be honest. It sounds like Swiss cheese. The technical analysis would tell me that I'm wrong and say, well, we follow the Fed, don't we? The Bank of England follows the Fed. But we don't. We do often when there's a global event affecting every economy that's intrinsically linked these days in the aftermath of the pandemic. However, with different policy responses, and here comes that word again, decoupling is more likely. And of course, that's what we've seen at the start of this week. We've seen the ECB start to break away. There's actually more historical precedent for decoupling than for following the Fed when we're considering more localised national economy situations rather than when we're dealing with the same thing, the withdrawal of credit in the post-2008 environment, or pandemic response overall and stimulus and loss of jobs as in the, or potential loss of jobs, certainly loss of economic activity as in the coronavirus pandemic. So, but you might say to me, well, they are dealing with the same thing, Adam, inflation. But my argument now is that the UK has dealt with their increase in the money supply by inflating accordingly, whereas the US has only dealt with about half of their increase. That is a big, big difference. And that's a soapbox I'm going to have out very, very regularly, cleaning it, polishing it, and definitely standing on it. Anyway, I think they are too high. Closed at 4.157 on the 5-year gilt for the week. But we opened Monday at 4.195, so it's still a win for the week, a slight move downwards. But the right price at the moment, in my view, is below 4%. In a week or two, I think the market will see the light. Thursday's close was a more realistic 4.075, and that compared with 3.995 on the close for the Sonia 5-year swaps. What a lovely number we want it to be starting with, a 3. This was 3.948 1 month ago and 4.531, which is pretty uncomfortable, a year ago, as we were ascending to that high point in the yield curve, which was early July 2023. The 2-year was a massive 5.119%, which is why rates at the time were over 7% on 2-year fixes. Currently they look more like 6.5%, so that's calmed right down. Although let's face it, it's still pretty punchy at 4.564 on the 2-year swap. So remember, I tend to add on 2% for limited companies or 1% for personal names. The problem with the personal names thing is still section 24. I'm disappointed to see that premium for limited companies is still being preserved, but that's what's going on. And when I learned the other day that 94% of let property is still in personal name rather than limited company, that was a bit of a wake-up call for me at the little bubble that I live in and talk about on a regular basis. But so now I'm going to decouple from the macro, and I want to talk about that decoupling for the rest of the time we've got today. This sort of confident notion that the central banks all follow the Fed. So perhaps we explore a few of the reasons why that might make sense or not. Firstly, central bankers are too scared to go out on a limb, maybe. I'm really not convinced it works like that. The members of the MPC, who are the members of the Bank of England, the internal members as they call them, are all deeply entrenched in the UK and its largest and most important financial institutions. The chief economist has had an international career, as has the deputy governor, but still with lashings of UK high finance. There is a public service element to the job for sure, and I'd be surprised if any of the internal members didn't simply want what's best for the UK. Individual votes are held to account. Well, they're absolutely not held to account. There's the occasional Treasury Committee after a meeting where someone like Therese Coffey slings mud without fact-checking and then gets roundly told off by the bank's officials. The committee votes with relative impunity, as they should. There's groupthink. What, across international borders? I don't think so. The Federal Reserve is more assertive, if not aggressive. They certainly seem like it. But what that meant in this hiking cycle, remember, is the UK actually jumped first, not waiting for the Fed, but decided on a slower pace of hikes than the USA did. Both of those approaches have worked so far. They look more culturally appropriate than anything else to me. So if the path down is slower and longer in the UK and the Fed tries to come down as quickly as they went up, which will not be recommended, that would also be an element of decoupling. What about the fact the economies are in the same boat, the UK and the US? They always have massive similarities, but the US has experienced far better growth than the UK for many, many decades now. The liberal nature of the laws protecting companies rather than individuals, for a start, very different in the US, and that's led to the survival of the fittest approach being very strongly there in the USA, with the inevitable fallout that's par for the course for some and unpalatable for others, and that's an ideological divide, of course. However, the US can raise unlimited debt, or at least that's the prevailing wisdom. Of course, they can't really raise unlimited debt, and the music only stops when it stops. But it looks like the band's got plenty of puff left yet. The US is much more allergic to holding its own bonds on the Fed balance sheet as well. There's plenty of nuances, though, to be considered, which make it true at a high level there are similarities, but incorrect at a more granular level. And look, I could come up with 5 more of those quite easily, but you can see how those objections can be and have been handled by me there. History also backs this up. Have a look at the tail of the tape from when the Bank of England became independent and appreciate that really we've had 2 crises within a 13-year period after that time. Really significant ones. You know, you're talking about a 1 in 75 year event when you talk about a massive debt deleveraging, and you're talking about a 1 in 100 year event when you talk about a pandemic. So to have those 2 13 years apart is pretty unlucky. And ultimately the economy just hasn't had that much time to recover between the 2. Those crises and the responses have led to this urban myth of following the Fed being reported as a fact, and it isn't. As reported by Reuters some time ago, just pay attention to the calm times. So this was from a Reuters write-up a while back. The Monetary Policy Committee took over the task of setting British rates in June 1997, because before then, remember, it was done by the government. I'm just looking at Vanessa's comment here. Right, yeah, lots of bitter pills. She's been talking about a 22-year portfolio landlord. I feel for you, Vanessa. It definitely hasn't got easier in the past 7 or 8 years. But just back to this for the moment. The committee followed the Fed's lead in tightening and loosening title for the first 6 years after they were enshrined as the people in charge of the UK base rate. So late 1998, easing cycle, Fed led by 1 month only. Mid-99 to mid-2000, the Fed was 3 months ahead. Cutting cycle in early 2001, Fed led by a month. That was in the wake of .com, apart from anything else. November 2002, Fed cuts, bank follows 3 months later. June 03, Fed cuts, bank follows 1 month later. But 03 to 07 were a little bit of a crack up boom sort of time realistically. Things were out of sync. Late 03 to August 04, the Bank of England embarked on a tightening cycle all on its own. 04 to 06, the Fed then began a tightening cycle. So actually the Fed followed the Bank of England there by some way. In the second half of 06 to July 07, the bank tightened some more. And this was to do with the trade-weighted sterling index, apart from anything else. That takes us all to the beginning of the financial crisis. September 07, the Fed cut, so it took 3 months later before the Bank of England cut. And then October 2008, the Fed and the Bank of England cut rates in a posse of global central banks as all hell breaks loose. But it was March 2009 before the Bank of England dropped their rate to 0.5%, remember. So we've seen other tightening cycles since that article was written, or attempted cycles. For example, Donald Trump's first term as president. The Fed were right on their own there, got their rates up to a couple of percent, and then had to climb all the way back down. And the ECB and the Bank of England didn't even consider it. Now, what about Brexit? That ultimately made a big difference. That's a pretty typical example of one of my nationalised examples rather than a globalised one that caused a big difference in divergence in policy. Bank of England were cutting while the Federal Reserve were hiking. So a cornerstone of my argument here is when there are significant global economic events, the central banks will follow each other, but they're not following each other. They're just having to deal with the same thing in a similar looking economy. It's as simple as that. And the Fed is simply more assertive or less conservative with a small c. When events are national, less global, this relationship falls apart. So forget about following the Fed. Why do we care so much, or why do I care so much maybe? Because of events like this week. My mortgages don't need to go up 0.1% because the US creates 100,000 more jobs than expected in the month of May. It's utterly irrelevant, and to pretend otherwise is bonkers at this stage. So the prevailing wisdom in the middle of the 2010s was that the natural central bank rate of interest would be about 2.5%. Now we weren't there, of course, we were at 0.5%, but that was going to be the natural rate of interest. It looked pretty fair at the time, but there was no effort really to get there. And then, of course, we had the referendum, which led to a cut rather than a raise in rates. The prevailing wisdom right now is that natural rate of interest looks more like 3.5%. Is that right? Is this just dealing with the extra sort of maybe 1%-ish of inflation that we expect after a pandemic that doesn't get talked about very often? Maybe. It doesn't feel too wrong to me at 3.5%. The bank never really says this, although the last time I went to a regional meeting, the rep did wave the pointer between 3 and 4% as his best indicator of where rates should be in a steady state. And the market agrees with this mostly. The key for those of us who are impatient is how long that steady state takes to reach. At least 18 months, and less than 3 years is the answer. It could be faster, of course. So just avoid a crisis and we're fine, right? That's easier than it sounds, of course. But don't create your own crisis is a good start. Trust me, it isn't the way forwards. Do you see what I did there? But be happy that Rachel Reeves is a competent and, while somewhat ideological, intelligent human being. Kwasi and Liz couldn't lace her boots. Rachel and I actually studied the same course at the same university, and so did Liz. Liz was a few years ahead, and I guess they were maybe short on applicants that year or something. We never met, to my memory. It would have been hard. I skipped too many lectures, to my sadness these days. Where the ideology is still a concern is that Rachel won't start from the place that I do when I consider likely policy impacts. People will behave as they are incentivised. Up the stamp duty rate on second purchases, make it even harder for landlords to join the sector, or rents will have to go up to reflect that additional cost of doing business. Continue on the compliance train, cranking it up to make a political point, push rents up even further. I'm not saying don't do that, I'm saying be honest about the consequences. Bring back the EPC changes, the minimum Cs, whenever that might be phased in now. Once the EPC has been revised, the home energy model, if you haven't heard of it, was supposed to be coming next year. But the consultation that closed at the end of March this year was supposed to lead to another consultation on EPC reform, which has now been scuppered by the election, of course. The changes being that C by X date, 2030, I don't know what, and there'll be one more flight out the sector once that's been legislated for, let's face it. The reality that the money comes in the long term, not from the cash flow for vanilla rentals, is denied for mortgage holders. There are plenty of unencumbered landlords, between 38 and 55%, according to various data sources, but still not all would invest their own money in EPC changes. It's the new supply that you choke off most aggressively, and the replacement rate of a sector, I'm convinced, would have been shown to have been shrinking in the past financial year once we finally get that data published by the civil service. In about 2 days, we're going to have the mortgage data for Q1 2024, and that will no doubt form part of next week's submission. Anyway, we started with decoupling, went through our likely next Chancellor and on balance her redeeming qualities. We've also got to consider polling, D-Day hiccups, Nigel, big lies, poor man's Donald Trump, Farage's candidacy, soggy suits and overall tone deafness. And it's just hard to like Rishi, isn't it? He's clever, but he's not likeable, and he never was. It's time to wish Rachel all the best with the new job and hope that Starmer stands up for 5 years. My bigger worries are by far what's behind him looking to wrestle that role away at the appropriate moment. The polling, just as I mentioned it, is Swiss cheese because they can't model reform because the party didn't exist. So there are still surprises on the cards. Reform needs some more publicity stunts and also a manifesto that doesn't go like the below. They could also have done with Holly Valance, let's face it, what's next in this election? But this is from their website. Overall, according to them, their proposals would create an extra 1 to 1.5% extra growth per annum. Extra 1% growth per annum, 25 billion on GDP. Tax at 40% spend, 10 billion. Not sure where they've got that 40% number from. Total extra growth assumption, 10 billion per annum of extra tax revenues. That's it. That's literally how they've done the maths on that. Let's just crack on and create 1 to 1.5% extra growth because we say we're going to. I don't know why anyone else didn't think of that, really. I don't think these guys know how the OBR works apart from anything else, but of course they'll probably be abolishing the OBR because it went really well last time someone overran the OBR. Oh, no, it didn't, Liz, did it? It didn't go well at all. If these jokers had got a real squeak when it came to the election, I think the bond markets would already be going mad. And that, folks, is How I Met Your Mother. Sorry, that's a different show. Actually, that's how I get myself to be thankful for the Labour Party. Can Sunak get any worse on the PR front, though? Or is it time to start betting against the massive spreads on a major Labour majority? Reform are expected in the betting markets to get about 7 seats, for reference. Here's the current midpoints of the spread bets. Labour 435, Conservatives 117, Lib Dems 45, SNP 18 and Reform 7. Now look, there's still 7% of children privately educated, and I don't imagine too many of those turkeys voting for Christmas. Some will. Maurice, I've seen your question there and I'll answer it in just a second. There's still the tax spectre to take on, and I'm not sure Labour are doing the best on that front by saying what they won't raise. Their traditional voter base doesn't pay anything other than VAT, income tax and national insurance, of course, but everyone pays council tax, and some of the middle live in high-banded houses or have kids at private school or, in honesty, have private healthcare and would absolutely use it if they needed to. They can still admire Starmer's position even if it isn't their own. I appreciated Sunak's honest one-word answer more, I must say. Anyway, enough. The train is hopefully decoupling, and if it does, and the markets get the memo, these things take months, sadly, then our gilt yields could easily be 25 to 30 basis points lower, in my view. If we stopped our stupid quantitative tightening programme, we could lose another 10 to 15 basis points on the 5-year gilts. So, markets and the Bank of England, get on with it. Maurice's question there was, where do I see the base rate in 5 years' time? Incredibly difficult one to predict. But that 3.5% sort of number is not the worst guess in the world. And I could easily see the gilt and swap rates hovering around the sort of 3 to 3.5% mark by then. So what do I think I'm going to, any 5-year fixes that I'm doing today, I'm thinking that in 5 years' time I'm going to come off at about 4.75%. That's roughly where I think the number will be. I shouldn't really be that precise because it's obviously a big spread, but I think that's where we could be in 5 years' time. We've still got this pandemic inflation to wash through. If you said 25 years' time, I expect to be back in the mixer where we're paying more like 4%, 3.5 to 4. I think that the longer term base rate will come back to that 2.5%, maybe around more towards 2%, and that's where we'll be. But this is all black swans aside, as Maurice already correctly said in his question. So well done for getting to the end, everyone. Remember the last few early bird tickets for the Property Business Workshop, Thursday the 4th of July, bit.ly, PBW3. And there's only one way you can ever deal with this continual noise and election claptrap, of course. Keep calm, always listen to or watch the supplement, and carry on. Thanks, folks, for tuning in.